Welcome to the San Diego Opera Podcast. My guest today is the stage director of La Cenerentola, Cinderella, Lindy Hume. Lindy, good to have you here.
Good to be here in San Diego.
From New Zealand or from Australia?
No, I'm from Australia.
But you've worked with New Zealand Opera.
Yes, I've done a lot of work with New Zealand Opera, and this is originally was a co-production between my company, Opera Queensland, based in Brisbane, and New Zealand Opera. So it's been to New Zealand.
So tell me about the genesis of this particular production. One of the things I think is really charming about it is that it's set in London Dickensian times.
That's right.
And it's got that look.
Yeah.
Why? What were you going for?
Okay, so when I was doing the research for Cenerentola in the first place, I came upon the felicitous information that La Cenerentola was the first opera performed for Australian audiences.
In Australia. Oh my gosh.
And
where?
It was done by a touring troupe of Italian opera singers.
Uh-huh.
And 1840. So it's really only 20 years-ish after it was written.
Wow.
So and I just have a fantastic image of what that must have looked like. That first performance in Australia in 1840, where there was nothing really, no cities and so forth. So anyway, so I sort of latched onto this year 1840, and then discovered that it was also the year that Victoria married Albert. Queen Victoria married Albert, and of course then you just look around that period, and of course you find the great popularity of the novels of Charles Dickens, who of course had his own experience of being something of a Cenerentola, something of a Cinderella. He was, of course, a child, a worker. He was farmed out by his parents to make some money for the family in a blacking factory, and of course then wrote Oliver Twist a few years earlier than that, so sort of late 1830s. So there just seemed to be so many parallels and so many wonderful little synergies that it seemed to be a perfect period to do it in. And it is, because the world of Charles Dickens, if you really animate that world in a very truthful way, very much almost like a film, the characters come wonderfully to life, and that's what we've done.
Well, and fairy tales published during that time, particularly in the English-speaking countries, had that look.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily, or they had a medieval look or a Renaissance look, but definitely through a Victorian lens, didn't they? Those drawings and etchings and illustrations, probably of some of Dickens' own work.
Yeah, and of course there's a fantastic inbuilt sense, particularly when you're looking at Charles Dickens, and if you sort of overlay that sort of sense, his very, very vivid sense of social justice, and in fact railing against the injustice of the polarity of the incredibly wealthy people and the incredibly poor people. And then if you look at Rossini, who of course had, whether he was a political figure or not, he had a very soft spot for the working class hero, for example, Figaro, and as it turns out, Cenerentola.
Well, who could be more a focus of the subject of injustice than Cinderella?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it all worked beautifully, and it sits really beautifully, and it just sits so, that period is only 20 years after Rossini was writing, so it feels very idiomatic, actually. It feels very comfortable in that space. So it also gives us a very vivid world that everybody knows and loves to reconnect with this story.
It's remarkable that both the libretto and the music were written within something like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like it was written in 3 weeks?
In a good way.
Yeah.
In a good way, because obviously he was in the zone for that 3 weeks.
Oh yes.
And he clearly was absolutely. When these artists are at their most creative, and it's an outpouring of creativity rather than the agonizing over an opus over many years. I kind of feel that Rossini, he was a very practical artist of the theatre, man of the theatre. And so he did have a deadline, but also he just worked fast. He just clearly worked fast, and it was pouring out of him. And that sense of its immediacy and its youth, he was only 25.
Right.
Its youth and its energy and his sense of a real connection with the singers he was writing for, particularly Gertrude Rignetti, who was his Cenerentola, but also his Rosina. There was obviously an incredible humanity and an incredible kind of camaraderie between the two of them. And I think that really obviously he just helped. He knew who he was writing for, he knew how it had to be for the theatre, and he just got on with it.
It's easy to think of pieces like Barber and Cenerentola and Rossini's other comedies that bubble so on the surface, and have such charming melodies, to stay on that surface. And one of the things that I'm impressed by every time I come back to one of those works is that it is ultimately very human.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have begun this opera in any number of ways, but she sings a folk song. It's not even about her plight, is it?
No.
It's a folk song about a king who has, the 3 women that he could possibly marry. He's got to choose one of them. A totally sort of objective piece, and yet the way it's set, you know what's wrong. You know how she's feeling, right? Do you see those kind of human moments all the way through the piece?
Absolutely. But the part that you're talking about, her little folk song, it's because it is such a motive, and you look at where it comes in the piece. Obviously, she has it as her work song at the beginning, and then it comes back again just before she meets the prince, and then the next time we hear it is at her very lowest ebb, where she's just left the man she loves behind at the party, and I feel in this version she feels it's impossible, and she'll never see him again, and for me that's the saddest singing of that little folk song. I feel like that little folk song is there in a way to comfort her and somehow remind her of her mother, and so it's plaintive, but it's also very special for her.
Yeah.
So those sorts of little gifts he gives you to work out how you're going to interpret them, and they're not. There's no right way or wrong way.
Right.
You have to act on instinct. You have to see what the singer who's playing the role responds to, and I think they should always be living, breathing works that can be that are contemporary to the audience.
Yeah, they're not just characters.
No,
they're
actually,
real human beings.
They are, but they're also there's a certain degree of with all fairy stories there are sort of archetypes, and the archetype of the evil, in this case stepfather, but the evil stepmother, or the fairy godfather or fairy godmother, those figures come out of the page of fairy tales all the time, and you know what they represent. Going through a forest represents a period of confusion, and coming out of the forest represents coming out of that confusion, or whatever. But it is ultimately one of these timeless fairy tales. So you have these multiple dimensions. You have the timelessness and the sort of iconography of fairy tales, but then you have the human dimension that's going to happen when you have actual human flesh and blood people playing those roles.
Right.
They are going to find what resonates with them. And then Rossini, one of the great humanists, really one of the great humanists, and somebody who he might have written fast, but he wrote really well. And he wrote for people, real people to sing, and for real people to enjoy in the audience.
Well, it doesn't surprise me at all that was the first opera to travel so far to Australia, because it's charming, it's touching, the music is wonderful, And I can't wait to see this production. I've seen still shots of it, and it looks absolutely delightful.
It is delightful, and it's an absolute labour of love to bring it here to San Diego. I'm so chuffed. It's been in Australia, it's been in New Zealand, it's been in Germany, and now here, and I couldn't be happier.
Yes. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.